Yeah, let's. I'm assuming they have this.
Yes, those mics are live. Yeah, you can hit the button too.
We could do this.
The green light's off. Right.
So Jen, how was your evening?
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to kick off with the fun logistical items here as we get started. First and foremost, I recognize it's freezing in this room, so we are working on the airflow situation to try and get it warmed up. If all else fails, we're just going to go outside and sit in the sun if it stays too cold. But otherwise, it should be warmer here soon. Coffee and tea and water over there, so please help yourself. Restrooms, my understanding is the men's room is back here, ladies' room is back there. So that's where those should be. And otherwise, if you need any help with anything or if you're having any issues, come find me. I'll either be sitting at that corner or over here, and I'm happy to help. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Megan to get started, and thank you all for coming.
Fluj Chisan and Saiga, Hayumasi Puschagu, Jet Fluj Pusnanich and Saiga, Nagani Megan Pishawash Ilai. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's really good to see you all here. Can you hear me all okay? Okay. No? Okay, I'll speak a little louder or I'll just shout. My name is Megan. I'm from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I'm also the tribal co-lead, and they strung me up here to kick this off, so we'll see how it goes. Wanted to start this meeting off with a tribal blessing, really started off in a good way, and remember why we're all here, which is for the ocean. Traditional protocol sort of dictates that you give deference to the most local tribes. So I would start by asking if there is a local tribal elder or representative from the surrounding area that would be willing to step up and give a blessing. We would very much welcome that. And if not, I would also ask that any of my other tribal elders in the room, if you're comfortable stepping up to give the tribal blessing, that would be most welcome. Anyone from the local area? I don't think so. Okay. Are there any tribal elders or others who would be willing to give the tribal blessing and start us off in a good way? Yes, please, Craig.
Good morning. What I essentially will do, I'll sing a prayer song that belonged to my great-grandmother, and just offer you, once I finish, to let you pray in your own manner. I'm essentially going to do is dialogue and make the connection, and you can say a prayer in your own to whoever you pray to. And I'll let that moment be. Let you keep putting that out. And at home, our elders always said, you don't have to stand. So if you can just sit and do this is fine. When it's called Siesta at home, we pray, sing these songs. We don't have to do it. It's just something that you have to, you don't have to. So at home we don't do it. I didn't bring a rattle. Generally, I would have a rattle. Thank you.
Hi, Masi, Greg. Thank you very much for that good starting. So now, just for everyone in the audience's benefit and also everyone around the table, I'd like to walk around and do introductions. Do you have anything to add, John? Oh, okay. Sorry. I'll try to talk louder. Greg, would you mind starting us off? Just a round of introductions, and we'll go around the table this way. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Greg Arnold, Vice Chairman of Contractor.
Marcy Aramco with the Pacific Fishery Management Council.
Shirley Laus, Trinidad Rancheria. I'm the Governmental Affairs Coordinator.
Good morning. I'm Amy Wertz with the U.S. Coast Guard, here representing the 11th and 13th District, which is California, Oregon, and Washington.
Good morning, Jennifer Hagan. I'm with the Paleut Tribe.
Good morning, I'm Terry Johnson with US EPA Washington, D.C.
Good morning, I'm Tracy Kirby. I am with the U.S. Navy representing 3rd Fleet, U.S. Navy 3rd Fleet.
I'm Walt Wilson. I'm with Department of Defense representing Navy Region Southwest.
I'm Becky Smythe, representing NOAA and also the acting federal co-lead for the federal.
Good morning, Joan Farmitsky with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Superior Department, and again, working with Becky as a co-lead for the federal.
Patty Snow, I'm the Coastal Program Manager for the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, and I'm also the state co-lead.
I already introduced myself, but again, Megan Flair with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, also the tribal co-lead.
Delahan Shakushi, Brandon Quaytate Fraley. I'm the Chief Governance Officer for the Tolowa-Dani Nation, and I'd like to pay special acknowledgement to my alternate that has traveled down with me today, Jaytek Steinreck, and our Natural Resources Director, Megan Van Pelt. I don't do this alone. I have a team, so I'd like to acknowledge them. And we represent the Southern Oregon, Northern California region as our ancestral territory.
Good morning, Jennifer Hennessy, Washington State Department of Ecology.
Oh, sorry. I'm Katrina Lassiter with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources.
Hi, I'm Ed Bowles with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Maddox. I'm with the California State Lands Commission.
Good morning. I'm Deborah Halberstadt with the California Ocean Protection Council.
Laura Brown with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians in Siletz, Oregon.
Margaret Corby with the Confederated Tribes of the Kuzlar, Umpqua, and Sayusla on the Oregon coast.
Courtney Hahn and RPB.
And would you guys on the side also, no, please. You are important. Everyone's important. Thank you, Steve. Okay, Hopefully I didn't miss anyone. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the introductions. For those of you who are in the audience and if there's anyone here around the table that's maybe in your region or sharing your interests, that's why we're here today, is to kind of get to know one another and see what all of our ocean interests are. And so the next meeting item here, agenda item, is member perspectives. And the executive committee was talking when we were trying to write this agenda, and I can't even take full credit for that because I really had a small part. There was a much larger team that wrote this agenda, but we wanted to start off really talking about why we're here today and what the different perspectives are, because you have a very broad group of representatives at the table. And so with that, do you have the slides? Does someone have slides? Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I asked the group if we could just share some of these pictures, because for me, this meeting up here, which I'll get to in a second, is really kind of the point of the RPB. It was actually mostly tribes at this meeting. So this was a meeting we had in Coos Bay, and I think, where's Margaret? There you are. The Confederated Tribes of Coos-Slar, Umpqua, and Sayusla hosted this meeting, and I have to extend my gratitude to you guys, as you were amazing hosts, and they really brought us in and allowed us to go out on their canoe and paddle around. And if we all could have started this meeting that way, that would have been excellent, but I don't think we can fit everyone here on a canoe, although we are on a boat, so that's, sort of the substitute. But the point that I really wanted to bring home with this is that, we started the day off remembering as a tribal people where we come from. There's a quote that's actually one of my favorites from Chasing Mavericks, the movie, if anyone's ever seen it. Yes, I'm quoting Chasing Mavericks. But the quote is, "We all come from the sea, but we are not all of the sea." And it continues. So my point is that for some of us, myself, the water is my home. It's not just the life force that feeds us, but it's the place I go to both find and lose myself. And for some of us, maybe you guys are mountain people, but I think most of you in the room are water people, which is why I love coming to these meetings, because I'm not the only water person. But so we started this meeting off remembering the water and where we come from and why we're here. And that's what I'm hoping to also share today. And Greg was gracious enough to start us off with a blessing. And for me, the beauty of this planning body is that it does bring so many different forces together. And with the tribes, at least, while we all share a lot of key values, and that it's our inherent right to make that our home and to have it as our home and to care for it and act as stewards for future generations. We're also, even with that said, very different. We all have different languages. We come from different places. We are kind of the embodiment of the land, and our culture is the embodiment of the land and the water. So I just kind of want to throw that out there for folks to remember, because while we do have similarities in that we are all here to care for the water, we are also very different. But with that, the water is the one thing that connects us all. You look at this body is centered around the California current. But even if you expand that and look across the way, it's the Great Pacific Ocean still connecting us even to other countries. Or for those who are inland, how the water system works. It flows down to the ocean and returns. So it's a cycle, and we're all connected. So I guess I'm going to keep this short because I want to keep us on task here and give other folks a chance to chime in with the different perspectives. But for the tribal perspective of this planning body, the benefit is that, we are at the table with equal seats, talking government to government, which is not an opportunity that we've always been afforded. So it's, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. The ability to come together and remember why we're here is, for me, one of the greatest parts about this. And that's what I would like to leave folks with today is, remember where you come from, remember why we're here. And I don't know if the tribes have anything else to add to that as far as a tribal perspective of the RPB. I'm sure you'll hear from all of us throughout this meeting, but that's what I would say. Just thank you for the opportunity, and that's what I will also be trying to do is remember the water. So if you all see me just constantly out on the deck or with my feet in the water, that's probably where I'll be. So, okay. If no one else has anything to add, John?
That's right. Thank you, Megan. That was really lovely. I wish I could be in a canoe too. Just from a state perspective, I think, as Megan was saying, the ocean is a shared resource across all of these entities that are sitting around the table, and we all have a shared responsibility for taking care of it. And none of us can do that on our own. And I think that's why we're here. More specifically, the benefits we've seen as a state of coordinating with this group of federal agencies, tribes, and other states is that we're able to improve our understanding of that resource. So improve the data and information that we have about the resource, how it's doing, so to speak, and who all is using it and where. And that kind of information is not just helpful on a small granular scale for a particular state, but it's important because this shared ocean resource is one that connects us all. And what happens in one area may affect another area. So we kind of need that bigger context in order to make our individual, more granular decisions. So being able to understand who all we can connect with and where that information is and improve that information is really important. The second thing that I think is really important is that, speaking to that data and information, is that our resources are limited as a state. And so being able to connect with other expertise, whether it's in a different federal agency or with tribes or others, being able to leverage our resources with a common voice around a particular need and get that information pulled together. So we've had really good success in being able to articulate common priorities, shared priorities, and get better information on our resources. And then the other one that Megan was sort of speaking to is really about relationships. And I like coming to these meetings because I get to see some people that I see more often, but I also get to see others that I don't see very often. And being able to have that personal relationship, understand that you can pick up the phone or send an email to somebody and they know who you are, they know where you're coming from, and you can ask them a question and get good resources to do your job more effectively. And that pulls through to the process for coordinating when a project is proposed, so that you know who those different entities are that will be involved in that decision, so that we can improve that process for coordinating early. So those are all the things that we see as benefits of being here. And selfishly, we have a state plan. And for those of you that are in the audience or around the table, we have some materials in the back. It's out for a comment right now. We see this venue as a place to help us implement that plan more effectively and to take the next steps. Yeah. I don't know if there's other state folks that want to say other things, but.
Walt, it's your turn.
Probably don't need a mic. So I remember clearly 3 years ago, was it 3 years ago when we started this? Sitting at the table and saying, what I hoped for was that we could all develop a forum that we would all stay at the table for, and we are all still here. That's one of our greatest accomplishments. I think that we have all decided that this is important, and we will stay here at the table and discuss our commonalities and our differences. We've learned a lot about each other and our cultures and our differences. From a federal perspective, I think this has given the federal government, very likely the state participants as well, a great deal of respect and at times pause for the way for the things we have learned about our tribal partners and how they relate to the earth, the strength they gain from it, and their need for their word to be heard by us. Having worked amongst tribal partners in my natural resource career I worked in Montana, Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and side by side with lots of tribal members. It's always been encouraging to me that when they speak of the earth and the resources, they always speak from the heart, and we hear that here all the time. And I know it's frustrating at times, not only to them, but sometimes to us, because it sounds like we are speaking from agendas. So we're listening, and everybody here at this table has the same sort of connection to the land that's one of the common things we have. One of the other things I want to say is it's a dangerous world. Representing the Department of Defense, we are probably in a position at this time than more serious than when many of us were children. So it's important that we stay together. We can work on the things that we can affect here, and that's our natural resource management and taking care of the ocean. There are things we can't affect, but we will make sure our words are heard here, and do the federal government and our state representatives make sure that the things that we care about here and our words are heard. Thanks.
Thank you, Walt. And with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to John Hansen here.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'll just pause to see if anybody else at the table does want to share anything just in that same context before we jump into more of the nuts and bolts of my update, since what you're saying is a lot more interesting than what I'll be saying. So I'll just pause to see if there's any additional thoughts at this point. And obviously, as we go, please feel free to chime in. As you'll see on the agenda as we go through it, I will be teeing up some of these issues and topics that we're going to discuss, and also hear from a number of you on various topics. But the hope is we've built in plenty of time to have discussion amongst all of you, as well as public comment. And so as much as you all love my voice, as I know on our monthly calls, et cetera, it is really a hope that we can have a good conversation today and hear from everybody and hear all the different perspectives that are at the table. I'm going to jump in here just with a quick snapshot of background on the RPB and the plan for today. I will keep it short and sweet, and then we're going to get into the caucus updates and a little bit more, again, nuts and bolts from the different government perspectives. Before I do that, I'm just going to quickly mention that we have public comment sign-up sheets in the back. So for those in the audience that do want to provide public comment, we have 3 portions, and they're listed on the different sign-up sheets. So you can sign up for 1 or 2 or all 3. We're going to see if we can correspond them to the agenda topic, so you can look at the agenda and see which public comment periods are, following which issues we'll be discussing. But obviously, you're open to comment on whatever you like, and we'll have plenty of time to do that as well. So with that, I'm just going to quickly go through background here a little bit around the history of the RPB and how this group is set up now currently. This goes back to 2010 with an executive order that came out from the previous administration establishing the U.S. National Ocean Policy and provided the opportunity to create regional planning bodies around the U.S. Many of you have probably seen the map of the 9 regions. I'm not going to put that up just because it's been used so much. I'm just going to try to keep this short. But for the West Coast specifically, we started to get organized in 2012 with the feds getting together to talk about this executive order and how it might be implemented on the West Coast. There was also a letter that was sent out to every federally recognized tribe on the West Coast from Washington, D.C. To assess interest in participating in a regional planning body or this type of marine planning forum. That was what really kind of kicked off the initial list of interested parties, both through the feds, which were called to participate through the executive order, at large, as well as interested tribes, and then also reaching out to the 3 West Coast states. I came on in 2013 and helped organize that initially for the feds and then working with the tribes and the states. And then, as Walt mentioned, we first met in January of 2015 as a formal group around a table to discuss whether we wanted to form an RPB, at which point we decided we did. And so that kicked off our process with developing a charter and then looking at the approach for the West Coast in terms of regional and sub-regional frameworks that we might proceed on, which you'll hear more about today. Early 2016, we finalized our charter, so it took a good solid year of work that you all were involved with, but we got to a good spot and have that on paper. Copies of that are in the back. And basically the setup, as you see around the table here on the screen, is every federally recognized tribe that participates has a seat, as well as each state government with 2 seats. Those are voluntary, so no state and no tribe has to participate in this. Though if there is an RPB in place for a region through the executive order, federal agencies do have to participate, and they have 1 seat per department or agency. We also do have a seat for the Pacific Fishery Management Council, so that's a designated seat to link to fisheries issues as well. The way we've set up the structure in our charter, as you can see at the head table here at the front, we have our co-leads. So that's 1 for Fed, 1 for tribe, and 1 for state. We have a bit of a juggling going on the federal side due to the administration change, and you'll hear more about that. But the co-leads don't oversee the other government parties. It's more to help with administrative issues, checking in with me, helping plan agendas, meeting planning, things like that, and a super helpful group. We have sub-regional planning teams, which you'll hear more about, and then additional options for work groups and other parties as needed. The idea for RPBs is laid out through the executive order, and the implementation handbook is to create a marine plan. That's up to the regions to figure out what that looks like and how that would be structured. So that could be different for each region. We have 2 that have been finalized on the East Coast currently. So we're in the midst of that process here for the West Coast, and you'll hear more about where we're headed with that. But ultimately, it's flexible. It's really up to the regions to determine what this looks like. A big point of emphasis for us is that this is not a top-down, federally driven initiative in the sense of the feds are coming in to tell everybody what to do. It's really more the feds are at the table, and the states and the tribes are really driving the process in the sense of what issues are important, how this should be shaped, and what the outcomes might be. So at our meeting last year, we discussed objectives. These are on the screen. On the 1-pager that's in the back, you have this laid out as well in text, but this is basically the overview of what we're up to. The idea is to support decision-making, really enhance data sharing, information sharing, and just look at what's happening out in the water. What are the existing uses, what's emerging, and are those being compatibly planned for? And ultimately being transparent and efficient. At our meeting last year, I remember we had a public comment where somebody came in and said they were terrified by the fact that there were so many government reps sitting at one table, which is understandable, I think, even though you're all very nice people, I know. But it was, I think, a testament to the fact that this group does have a number of folks, but that's the whole idea in the sense of having a transparent and efficient conversation where you're all able to tap into one another, talk through these issues, and discuss them in an efficient way that might not otherwise be possible. In terms of the functions of the RPB and what we're up to, really these are the high-level issues, and we have more detail on these if folks want to discuss. But really looking at coordination and communication amongst all of you as government partners for the full West Coast, looking at how we can build those partnerships and what planning is happening, how we can strengthen it. Looking at where different products are coming out around planning, whether in different tribal areas, state or federal. How can we harmonize those? So have the conversation so those are all talking to one another and not being done in a bubble. Data is obviously a huge piece for everybody, so that goes without saying, but something we've been working very hard on. And then ultimately, how do we keep this conversation going? If this is of value and we see benefits of this, how do we support it? What does it look like for all of you that have day jobs that are not focused on the RPB and make that use of your time as best we can? So over the last year, what we've been up to, having our forum underway, so we have regular calls with the full West Coast region. We're looking at data, as I mentioned, as a big piece of that. Steve and Andy, who introduced themselves, are the co-chairs for the data portal, so that's our key channel there for data. We have a communications and engagement plan. You'll hear more about that later today, and copies of that are available in the back. So looking at how we really engage effectively. The regional ocean assessment is a key piece for every region, looking at the science to support planning. And so we're just getting started on that and have some initial pieces. There are some documents in the back on that, and you'll hear more this afternoon about that. But again, science as data go hand in hand as a critical piece to support effective planning. And then ultimately for us, a big piece is the subregions that we're thinking about. For the West Coast, we have a large region geographically with a large number of governments. It's a little bit unique compared to other regions. And so we've initiated the idea of subregions being an approach that might help us do that more effectively. And you'll hear more about that this afternoon. But that's something we're starting on in different areas at different paces, but something that we see as a path to help us grapple with this large coast we have. So subregions I mentioned, just quickly here, I won't go through this in too much detail, other than they're voluntary opportunities to create planning teams building around existing efforts. Ultimately, it's up to the members to determine what those look like, how that process would play out, how non-RPB members would be engaged, and what the products would look like, ultimately coming back to the RPB for approval. Currently, as we sit right now, we have a subregional planning team for the Washington Pacific Coast. That's our only formal team at this point. We do have initial introductory dialogue happening around the Oregon and Northern California coast. That's not a subregion as defined through the RPB or a team at this point, but something we're just starting to talk about. And otherwise, in the rest of California, we do not have any formal dialogues underway. So looking ahead into 2018 in terms of where we're at with just funding and capacity, we do currently have funding through NOAA, through the Moore Foundation, and through the Udall Foundation. You can see here the list of areas that are supported, including staff, my time, and part-time staff support, as well as a contractor for the data portal, funding to help support this meeting, getting people here and having the space here on the Queen Mary, having tribal-specific support, so making sure tribes are able to travel and attend meetings and participate. We do have a project that we're funding through UC Santa Barbara's Bren School, focused on ocean acidification, that's able to be funded through our grant, as well as looking at sub-regional development, having meetings, looking at tools that might help that, and then obviously the basic aspects of overhead document printing and all that fun stuff. So for today, this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to hear from all the co-managers here at the table about what is actually happening through different channels of government, looking at where the RPB is at in 2018, both over the last couple of years, what progress we've made, and as we head into 2018, what's working, what's not, having an open conversation about that, hopefully hearing from the public as well. Likewise, for subregions, you're going to hear about what is happening with the Washington Coast team, with this initial dialogue happening in Oregon and Northern California, as well as some other planning efforts that are not related to the RPB, but are West Coast planning efforts specifically that are relevant to issues on the coast. We'll have a session on stakeholder engagement. We have our plan as mentioned, so we'll go through that and how we've developed that and where we're at with that process. And then finally, you'll hear about the science assessment and the data work for a good chunk of time. And so throughout, we will have public comment. As mentioned, the first is going to be right before lunch. Then we'll have one mid-afternoon and then one at the end of the day. So as I said, the sign-up sheets are in the back. So we really hope folks are able to provide comments. So please feel free to sign up for those. We're going to try to keep it to approximately 3 minutes per comment, depending on how many people sign up. So we will adjust that as needed. But if folks can plan for that to provide public comment here to the group, that would be great. That's all I have. Here's the contact info. Folks that are on our emails have all of these, but just in case, that's my email and our website. All of the materials for today's meeting are available on the meetings page, as well as background documents. We also had a public webinar earlier this year that's available as a recording online. And I believe the plan is after this meeting, we're going to do a webinar probably in January that will provide a recap of this meeting, both for those here and those that weren't able to attend. And so that'll be on our website as well. With that, I am now going to shift into the portion of our agenda on caucus updates. And first up, we have our federal caucus update from Joan with BOEM and Becky Smythe with NOAA.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to lead off, and Becky and I, as co-leads, are co-fed leads. Co-fed leads. I should have brought cocoa because it's so cold in here. But anyway, we'll be doing this in tandem. But the first thing we wanted to do, the next slide here, is give you an update on the national perspective on the national ocean policy in particular. As John said, it was adopted in 2010, and it does call for the development of coastal and marine spatial plans that build upon and improve existing federal, state, tribal, and regional decision-making and planning processes. So you know, the executive order still does stand today. It has not been changed. And it is the framework for planning that's occurring in 9 regions around the country. Some of the regions are more active than others, and you'll hear from later in the day? No, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic? It's tomorrow. Sorry. But Betsy's here, right? So just to point her out, Betsy Nicholson is here, and she has been involved for many, many years with the Northeast Regional Planning Body and would be able to interact with you if you have any questions about how they've made significant progress with their group. But for us here, we do know that the National Ocean Policy was adopted under a different administration than we are currently under. And regardless of that, the core elements of marine planning, which have been enumerated, I think, now by Jen and Megan and Walt and John, everyone talks about the core elements of marine planning that are necessary to advance the priorities of any federal administration. That's essentially what we've, in short, been calling good government. We want to be connected, we want to be communicating, and we want to be sharing all the information and data that we can to make those good decisions. So as you can see from the faces around the table here today, we have federal agencies continuing to participate on the West Coast RPB and work towards its goals. And I think we had a caucus meeting earlier this morning, and we all agreed that we benefit from this participation. So since our longstanding federal co-lead for the RPB, John Stein, retired from NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center last January, Becky Smythe from NOAA, and I have been sharing this role as co-leads. We're going to talk a little bit about the potential for another co-lead, but it won't be happening until we actually get more activity on the National Ocean Council. Okay.
Yeah, so just as a transition, I think one of the things we all realize is that from our perspective, a lot of the political leadership in DC is still not in place. So we're anticipating more direction about this as political leadership starts. I mean, for our agency, NOAA, which is obviously one of the large ocean agencies, we have a nomination and the first confirmation hearing was held, but we still don't actually have a lead, politically appointed lead for NOAA. So we anticipate over the next couple of months, as more of these political appointees get into place across the federal government, we'll be hearing more guidance and support for some of the marine activities. We did want to provide a little comment, next slide please, Sean, where we are in context, the West Coast with some of these other groups. And as Joan mentioned, my colleague Betsy Nicholson, a long, wow, you use long a lot, makes us feel all old, it is in the back to help provide some perspective of what made the Northeast successful and some lessons learned. So we'll be hearing from her tomorrow. We do have copies, both the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic did complete their marine plans. They've both had long-standing RPBs, developed robust data portals. They're really actually great websites to look to as references, and developed a marine plan. We have copies up here up front. The Northeast is wordier because that's what Northeasterners do. I was born there, so I can say that. So if people want to look at what plans have been developed and submitted, we can. Obviously, the West Coast, we have a portal. We'll be hearing more about that today, and we have an RPB, but we don't have plans yet, and that's one of the things we'll be talking about, our progress to it. We do have some other regions who have some really good data portals, but chose not to do RPBs, and others who are doing marine planning in various aspects, but not through RPB-like discussions. They're using other venues. So the Great Lakes and the Alaska in particular, GOMA works a lot, obviously, on energy siting, but don't have an RPB either. So there's different regions have tackled this in different ways, and I think with the sub-regional context, we're tackling ours yet in another unique way. So Joan, did you want to talk a little bit about resources, and I can?
Thank you. Our budget, here's our piggy bank. It's not broken yet, but hey, you know, we're headed, headed there. Japanese yen. Yeah. Well, so the underlying premise for the National Ocean Policy activity is that it did not come with any dedicated budget from the federal government for implementation. That was from the outset. So this is nothing new that we don't have any dedicated resources for the RPB. It's been up to each region to find the funding for its marine planning. Here on the West Coast, we've been benefited by having funds come from NOAA for the RPB coordinator position that John occupies now, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for some staffing, meetings, support, projects, and travel support for state and tribal members. From BOEM, we've been able to provide support for the data portal and the Udall Foundation and the Bureau of Indian Affairs for tribal travel support. But each federal agency determines how it will dedicate staff time. So that's the in-kind contributions that federal agencies make to the RPB, and each agency funds the travel for its own people to come. I think the same is true for the state and in some measure the tribes as well in terms of definitely time. So we're all supporting it by what we give personally. But we do expect the West Coast region will continue to need, money, and we want to identify funding for our own marine planning work into 2018 and beyond. We don't have much of a budget outlook at this time. Our continuing resolution extends through Friday, and there's talk of a second one that might be issued through December 22nd. So we are waiting to hear too. We're all in the dark on what will be funding for our jobs and the work that we do here as well. So we're at this point where we cannot commit any funds to the RPB now, but we will continue to evaluate potential funding as the picture becomes more clear.
Thanks, Joan. And I would add that that's also part of the agenda we'll be talking about is various scenarios for funding. I am, continue to be encouraged by the federal agency representation at these meetings. We have additional federal agencies and even additional people from our bureaus in the audience. Unfortunately, some couldn't get here today because of the wildfires in Ventura are affecting a number of us. And I will allow an excuse for my federal co-lead if she steps out. Her house is near the evacuation zone. And Sarah Giltonen, who has provided a lot of support for the federal, is actually had to leave because her house is in the fire area. So I want to extend my thanks to Sarah, who's not here, as well as Chris Wall from NOAA, who have actually helped a lot with the federal. But we remain dedicated to finding ways to support this even in time. The strange times we've been experiencing along the West Coast this past year.
Great. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Becky. So next up, we're going to hand it over to Megan for a tribal caucus update.
All right. So just for the benefit of if anyone in the room is not as familiar with sort of the origin of the tribal caucus, I would say that our purpose for coming together is quite similar to the state and federal caucuses, but it's also slightly more complex. So with that, one thing I didn't note kind of in the opening speech that I wanted to make sure I did now was on one of, I think it was the federal folks' slides there, it showed the different RPB regions. I would say our tribal caucus group here with the West Coast RPB is just slightly different in that we have, over 120 tribes, 140? Okay, 140. Whereas on the East Coast, because of the way things were settled and developed, there are much fewer tribes. So, and as John alluded to earlier, when I do speak up here today, I'm not necessarily representing each and every tribe. They all have their own voices. I'm hopefully just trying to give the general consensus of the things that the tribal caucus has worked on and talked about between last year's meeting in October and this meeting today. So just take everything I say with a grain of salt a little bit. With that, so the overall goals for the Tribal Caucus were really derived from the fact that there was a great need for the tribes around this table and those who are not at this table today to get together to talk about, what was going on with RPB. We all have, like I said before, very different and similar viewpoints, and we don't always have the opportunity to get together and just say hi to one another or see what's going on and kind of talk amongst one another as tribal people and tribal representatives to say, hey, what do you think about this? How can we contribute our tribal voice? Our voice is already very strong, but when we come together, it's almost like a shout. So that was where the need for the Tribal Caucus derived. And the goals to date, at least what I've been trying to do in my position as co-lead, is really build tribal capacity and create a venue where the tribes can come together and coordinate and discuss what's, as the RPB develops or as other ocean planning issues or activities develop. Those are the primary goals. So with that, we've had a couple meetings in the past year, and in the past year, I mean from October till now. And we had a couple phone calls early on, and this last year has really been more focused on trying to elect a tribal co-lead and co-chair for the RPB and the West Coast Ocean Partnership. Your tribal co-chair for the West Coast Ocean Partnership is Greg Arnold over there, and I'm the co-lead for the RPB. And then other topics have really been centered around the development of these RPB subregions. So just like the feds and the state representatives have different jurisdictions, so do the tribes. And those don't always fit within the designated state lines. So we've really been trying to come together at both a sub-regional and a regional scale to say what's going on, how do we make this work, how do we make planning bodies or this one planning body fit all of our different values and jurisdictions and needs. And then with that, other topics of focus to date have been the tribal capacity building, which has ranged from data and mapping. So you'll hear, I think, is it later today? Is Megan presenting later today? Okay. There's a tribal representative here, Megan. I'm sure you're out in the audience, but I can't see you right now. Who will give a brief update on their marine traditional ecological knowledge database system. So trying to build that capacity within tribes, to build their own ecological knowledge databases, and then also trying to build the capacity to engage with all these other data sharing activities. And some of that, like I said, it gets complicated because some of that data is our inherent knowledge that's not meant to be shared. But we also have a voice, and we do have, what some would term data, and also trying not to get lost in that whole process. And then also in terms of tribal capacity building, the group has really focused on connecting with other tribes and nations and other RPBs. So we had 2 in-person meetings this year. One was in April in Sacramento, and the other was last night here. And in April, we brought in, I brought in, one was a letter and the other was an actual person, but basically different viewpoints from other tribal representatives, tribes and nations that serve on, say, like the Northeast RPB, or the planning body up in British Columbia. And we brought them in because we're still so early in this planning stage in this planning body. We brought them in to try to say, how did you guys coordinate with your constituents? What were your lessons learned? What can we learn from you to make this process run more smoothly? And how did you really ensure that your tribal voice was heard? With that, like I said, there are such different dynamics in each region. It makes it very interesting. And then last night we talked briefly about, actually a number of these things, sub-regional updates, but we also got to talk a little bit about what our tribal goals are for 2018, this coming year. And with that, the the primary goal was really continuing to build relationships amongst the tribes and the state and federal representatives. It's, again, all about that connection and that relationship building. With that, though, and it's important to note that, while this venue is great and it allows us to build those relationships, it doesn't replace the direct and individual government-to-government consultation. So there are still processes that will happen outside of this planning body where each of these government entities will interact with the tribes directly and one-on-one. This is also a venue to help boost that communication, so we can pick up the phone and say, hey, Patty, I have this going on, or vice versa, and build those relationships. So the other goals for 2018 that the Tribal Caucus identified, one was having a marine spatial plan. We saw on that graphic, the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic now have a marine plan. I think there are different ideas as to what goes into a marine plan, and as Bree over here mentioned, marine spatial plan and a marine plan could be two very different things. And correct me, tribal reps at the table, if I'm misspeaking in any way, but I believe what we identified was a marine spatial plan as a goal. And then with that, having a plan where we can clearly define the jurisdictions of each entity and the processes. So how do we work interjurisdictionally? And then developing a mutual understanding of trust responsibility within all of those plans and processes. So again, all of that really centers around the relationship building, knowing one another, knowing what we're responsible for, how we interact with the ocean, and how we're all caring for it in our own individual ways. So with that, I'm gonna just ask really quick if any tribal reps around the table want to chime in, or if I missed anything as far as a general update. That is what we have been up to this last year. Okay.
Thanks, Megan. We'll hand over to Patty for the State Caucus update.
Okay. Hello. Again, I'm Patty Snow. I'm the Coastal Program Manager for Oregon and the state co-lead at this point in time. So we'll just have a few slides. First, wanted to start out by saying the states, we each have each state has 2 representatives on the RPB, and we're actually all here. So I'm really glad. So if you have any questions for any of the state folks, we're all here. And all representing different agencies, different aspects that deal with ocean planning in our respective states. I actually wanted to back up and say that it's really nice to be in California. The last few times that we've met, it's always been in Portland, which is very nice, but it's definitely warmer and drier here. So nice to be in Southern California. Next slide. Just wanted to talk a little bit about priorities, and of course each state is a little bit different, but wanted to mention like aquaculture. You may have heard that there was some Atlantic salmon that got out of some net pens in Washington recently, so that's a big deal in Washington. Oregon, we don't have any aquaculture in our ocean areas. We do in some of our bays, but not offshore. But it's certainly something that folks are very interested in. We're a little doubtful that with the high energy of our coast that it's going to be very plausible, but folks still want us to be identifying areas that are potentially available for that. And in California, I know it's already moving forward, especially in some areas. So it's definitely of interest along the whole West Coast. Renewable ocean energy, certainly that's of interest to all of us. You'll hear later, of course, about the wind energy planning that's occurring here. I'll talk a tiny bit more about what Oregon's marine renewable energy, marine spatial plan. So all of this, and of course, Washington, you'll hear more about that later today too. So we're all very interested in marine renewable energy. Blue technology was something that California mentioned as an upcoming for their state, and I think that's probably going to be true for all of the West Coast states. And then marine protected areas, we all have marine protected areas of one kind or another. Things that perhaps aren't so closely linked to planning, we're certainly all very interested in resilience, climate change, sea level rise, and Oregon's tsunami planning is a huge issue for us. Marine debris, Oregon just recently, we just now have a NOAA approved marine debris plan that we're very pleased about. And changing ocean conditions is a big deal for all 3 West Coast states. We're all very involved with ocean acidification and hypoxia, something that we're all involved in. Other issues that we're interested in, seafloor mapping. Ultimately, we want to have the whole West Coast seafloor mapped. Sustainable communities links to with many of these things. And then sediment management. We all deal with dredge disposal and what we need to do with that. So next slide. So just also wanted to say just a little snapshot, and you'll hear a lot more about some of these issues, what each state is doing in terms of marine planning, and apologize if I didn't get everything here. I'm sure I didn't, actually. California, of course, they have the Marine Protected Areas Act, which was quite a process that they underwent a number of years ago now. So they have that process, and you'll hear more later today about the BOEM in California, the offshore wind planning that's occurring offshore in California, and also you'll hear more about the San Diego Ocean Planning Partnership. So I did want to mention those, and California, feel free to chime in afterwards if there's anything major I missed here. Oregon, we do have a territorial sea plan that covers out to 3 miles, which is the state's jurisdiction. And we adopted a marine spatial plan for the area that addresses marine renewable energy in 2012. We also have a system of marine reserves that Ed Bowles, our other state rep, Fish and Wildlife Commission in Oregon, is the one that manages those reserves. So we have a system of 5 marine reserves. And then at the moment, we're involved with updating the Rocky Shores update of our territorial sea plan. And Megan actually is on our Ocean Policy Advisory Council, so we're very happy to have tribal representation. And so if you have any questions about that, you can talk to either Andy Lanier, or myself. We're very involved with that. In Washington, you'll hear more about their marine spatial plan that they're doing for the Pacific Coast, and it deals with a number of issues. So I just wanted to have a brief overview of what all the states are doing in terms of marine planning, ocean planning. Next slide. And then finally, what are the benefits that we see from the RPB, and actually going back even further in terms of regional ocean partnerships? Certainly increased coordination is huge for us. Between the states, if we have an issue that comes up, we know who to contact in those states. It's not even a question, so that's great. And we have coordinated over the last year, not necessarily under the auspices of this group, but we have a joint letter that went to BOEM on proposed oil and gas leasing, for example. And we coordinate with all the states on, as I mentioned, ocean acidification and hypoxia. And certainly better communication with the tribes. Hopefully we at least, we're communicating with Oregon tribes, but now we have a much better line of communication with this, especially some of the Northern California tribes that have an interest in Oregon, which we didn't even that really didn't happen before with our marine reserves. They really weren't involved with that process at all, for example. And with federal agencies, certainly we have we communicate a lot with NOAA, but with BOEM and the Navy and other agencies. So I think that's been a huge benefit for the states. And then improved data coordination. The state of Oregon, we have a number of staff people that are actually working with the data portal because we feel that it's so important. And certainly, if any projects that are proposed offshore, or if we end up doing it, well, hopefully we will end up doing a marine spatial plan, but data is crucial for that, coordinated data. And if we have any projects, and again, as I think other folks have mentioned, the data portal, coordinated data has been probably a cornerstone of both the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic plan. So we see that would be true. We see that's very obvious that would be true for West Coast as well. So with that, I think it's been helpful. We don't have organized calls. We really probably should. We have one in the last year. We met last night. Some of us, I think, didn't want to have monthly calls because I thought that would probably be a bit burdensome for folks, but I think perhaps every other month would be a good option. So with that, I don't know if any other states, California or Washington, wanted to add anything. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Patty. Appreciate it. So that sums up the caucus updates. Thank you, everybody, for that. We are going to now shift into a bit of a discussion here where I will just tee up some of the questions that we've talked about over the last few months, looking ahead to this meeting. And I think the hope is for this session to, rather than have just continued updates, which are helpful, but setting the table to kind of know where the RPB came from and where it's at now in late 2017, and more so your perspectives coming from different government places and issues that are important to you. We wanted to, I think, just check back in on the RPB as a forum to see how's it going, what's working, what's not, what are the things that we can highlight that are helpful that we can build upon, what are the things that maybe we need to shift course on to make better use of, and know that this is really a flexible process. We've never really done this before, so we want to be really on top of what we're hearing from all of you. And for the purposes of this meeting, obviously this is a short half-hour session on the agenda, so we won't get to everything, but at least to give an opportunity to hear from a number of you, maybe folks that haven't spoken up yet, and think about where we are headed into 2018. And this will be followed by public comment. So for those in the audience too, we'd encourage you to provide feedback in any way you'd like as well, both on the things you've heard about already or some of the things we bring up now about the RPB headed into next year. So that's what we'll be hitting on, talking about where we've come from since 2015, the objectives that we did identify, which I'll bring up here in a second. How are we doing on those? Are we achieving those? Are we making progress towards them? Are we not? And what can we do better? Really taking a regional scale look at this. So we have a big West Coast. We have a lot of folks at this table that are participating. How are we doing with that and managing the scale that we have and keeping all of you looped in and moving on things? And then looking at 2018, what are we going to do that can enhance what we're up to? How can we get better at it? So this, as you saw this morning, are objectives, looking at decision-making and planning. So how do we bring co-managers, all of you, together to talk about that, the decision-making process and planning that's happening off the coast? How are we doing on info sharing and data coordination? So obviously the data portal is a huge piece of that. But what can we do as an RPB entity to help support that more effectively and bring all of you into that conversation? And then lastly, at a higher level, looking at what is happening off the coast. Are there things that you all are seeing for the West Coast that are emerging uses or that are becoming high priority existing uses that we need to be talking about and really coordinating on a region-wide scale? This afternoon, we're going to be talking about subregions, and that's where we've thought there are probably areas we can target at smaller geographic scales and specific issues tailored to different areas of the coast. But taking a step back, is there a role for the RPB at a true region-wide scale that we can more effectively look at those uses that do span the entire coast? And then ultimately, how are we doing in terms of efficiency and transparency? That's a huge piece for this. We don't get all of these folks together to talk behind closed doors. We do it to have you all coordinating, but also then share that with folks like those here in the audience and other stakeholders that are interested, to let them know what you're up to. What are the issues you all are dealing with? How are you dealing with them? How are you supporting them with data and science information and coordinating around that? And are there ways we can get better at that as well? So here are our functions again. I won't go through these in detail, but looking at the objectives that we do have on the last slide, these are the things we've laid out for what the RPB actually does to achieve them: coordinating and communicating, looking at how we enhance planning and harmonize, data being a big piece, and then we're moving on capacity to support it. So looking back in November, we had our monthly call, and if you remember, what we've started earlier in the fall is adding a discussion session on each of our monthly calls. Just as a side note, we do have summaries of our last 3 calls on the table in the back, so for folks that are interested, they're also on our website just to see more detail on those and the notes of those calls. But we added portions to allow a more open-ended conversation, kind of like I think what we're hoping for right now, to let people provide their own input on this in terms of what are we doing in terms of developing the RPB and how are we doing at it. So when we heard from all of you and teeing that up for the group, the benefits that you all identified, and we've heard some of those already this morning, have landed on some of these spots that you see up here. Sharing updates between everybody, having those communication channels in place and sharing lessons learned, building the relationships between all of you is a key piece, again, we heard this morning. Looking at a shared understanding of priorities, having you all coming from different places and different governments, what are the priorities you have in common and how can we understand those better? Looking at enhanced data sharing, so again, tapping into the portal as a leveraging point for data. And then forming subregions. You all saw that as a benefit, that the RPB was supporting that, and that was in our recipe book, so to speak, in our charter, and we've been moving on that, which is the step that we had laid out initially. Some issues that we thought were worth further discussion. We're looking at what are our tangible planning products. As we already mentioned, you look at the Northeast, you look at the Mid-Atlantic, they were a few years ahead of us, but they did come up with a plan at the end of it. Are we on that same path? Is our plan, quote unquote, going to look the same? Is it going to look different? How tangible is it at this point? And how do we proceed down that path to rally around something? I think a lot of our effort up to this point has been process, for better or worse. And so how do we come out of those process clouds and get towards some actual planning products that are going to be helpful for all of you, and what do those look like? Looking at regional drivers, this is a big one. I know in other areas, especially on the East Coast, there were certain proposals or issues that really drove the conversation. We haven't really had that on the West Coast in the sense of, something very specific that rallied everybody to say, we have to deal with this now. It's been more, we all can talk and we can see what these issues might be, but we don't have one big red flag or one thing that has sort of given us a starting point. So are those drivers out there? Are we identifying them effectively? Do we see them coming? Are there other things that we need to be talking about? Capacity is a big one. We have myself as a staff person for the RPB, and obviously I'm really amazing, so I can do what all I can do. But the reality is we have a big group here. We have subregions that we're starting to tee up. We have all of you that, again, do not have RPB on your job descriptions. So how do we support what we're trying to grow here as a bigger, broader forum and dialogue in a number of ways? And really, I think just acknowledging that and reality checking where we're going into 2018. Stakeholder input is a huge one. So that's something that we have in our communications and engagement plan. I think we've had starts and stops on that, and I've done what I can, but a lot more to do on that. And having meetings like this is a great chance, but this is, again, one day. And so what can we do in a meeting like this, but then how can we plan ahead for broader input at a regional scale or potentially at a sub-regional, multiple sub-regional scales to have stakeholders better connected to what we're up to. And then federal support, looking at the feds, obviously the uncertainty around the national ocean policy, how feds are engaging, how they will engage in the future is a question that people are obviously interested in. To this point, the feds, as you've heard already, are committed and are here at the meeting and continuing to show their support. And so that's obviously great. But with the new administration, there is some uncertainty about where things are headed. And so making sure we have clarity on that as much as we can. That's all I have for the teeing up. So I, with that, wanted to open the floor to hear on any of those things that I mentioned, both in terms of things that are helpful, things we need to keep talking about. I'm going to cut myself off here and give you all the silence to fill. So if anybody would like to start, I will just say we do have the live web stream going, so I'll ask if folks are going to chime in to please try and use the microphone, both for the audience here, but also through the webinar so people can hear you that way as well. So does anybody want to offer up something to start with in terms of looking ahead in terms of benefits or things that we need to keep talking about that might need a little bit more attention heading into next year? Yeah, this was the list of, I think, looking back, how things have, yeah, we can start there if you want, yeah. Thanks, Becky.
I just found actually what Patty presented as far as the issues that the states have identified, whether they're common or unique to different areas like the aquaculture thing, really enlightening. And when we talk about that second place that we could improve about the issues that might drive us either across the region or within the subregions, that's something, I think would be beneficial for the feds to do as well. And, granted, we're in a time of changing some of the changing priorities, like right now, one of the priorities NOAA would be bringing to the table from the Department of Commerce level is aquaculture and opportunities for it along the West Coast. So I think one of the ways maybe the federal agencies can work is starting to think about some of those issue drivers, both common across, and we have some starts to it, but it might be time to sort of check in on that. I don't know how others feel and whether that would be helpful to the tribes or states and engaging around that.
And you can also introduce yourself too, so folks at home know.
Thank you. Jennifer Maddox, I'm the Science Policy Advisor to the Executive Office at the State Lands Commission. And just kind of jotted myself a couple of notes. John, when you were going over sort of our three, I think, mission-oriented goals and kind of what's region-wide, why the West Coast RPB. And the first thing that I thought of was sort of that the weight of the team in terms of the shared vision, the inspiration, and the momentum that it brings, that you're not just, a solo voice kind of putting yourself out there. So for me, and I think on behalf of our agency, is really just what it brings in terms of community. Again, the community, the relationships, and sort of really recognizing and then moving collectively toward that forward-thinking planning. I actually think that we have a huge opportunity that I hope that we in California grasp. California is a tricky place. It's very complex. We have a lot of regulatory agencies and a lot of people interested in the ocean, and a lot of sort of competition and a lot of concern. This is an opportunity, I think, to really sort of disrupt the status quo and flip it. And I really I don't see the lack of a issue driver being a problem. I see it as a benefit. I think that from our perspective, with the support of our commissioners who have kicked us off into our little pilot partnership with the Port of San Diego, we view this as a real advantage to not have an issue driver or two issue drivers, because then we can really get away from perceptions by others that it's some sort of a zoning effort or an industrialization effort, and we can really focus on a comprehensive, real ecosystem enhancement, ecosystem-based planning that reduces the somewhat of chaos involved sometimes in a sort of a reactive mode. And it takes you out of like, well, we're doing this because we had a lot of pressure for aquaculture, or because we had a lot of pressure for a wind farm. So we're really able to step back and view it from the collective, and view it where there's an equal weight, if not more so, given toward how do you structure planning and information sharing to afford folks who do want to do projects the best tools available, and then how can we as agency, management agency, and holding the public trust, really start looking proactively to get ahead of proposals, to get ahead of people who want to use the ocean or put things in the ocean in certain ways, and forestall potential sort of maladaptive projects, particularly in the light of all of our climate issues, to look for projects ourselves, or to look for things that we can do ourselves, and not something that's always driven by sort of use proposals. And so the partnerships and the information, the wisdom and sharing that we have gotten from the Oregon partners, the Washington partners, then from Walt, has been incredible. And I think that's a real strength of the RPB, is to really, I think more than anything, help to, I won't say steamroll, that is totally the wrong word, help to bring some of the less optimistic or some of the more reluctant players really into the fold, to show that no, it's not, this is not something that is just an industry driven effort. It is really something that we're doing to protect, to reduce the chaos, and to provide information that is a tool, that is not a zoning effort, that is a tool to provide information as pressures on the ocean get more and more. So sorry that was really long-winded, but
no,
that's my
that's
cheerleading
what we're here for.
for this.
No, thank you.
So Jennifer Hennessy, Washington State Department of Ecology. I just wanted to piggyback off of Jennifer Maddox's comments, because I think that's what we found in our state planning process, is that we're setting the table and the framework for when projects are proposed, having the good information regardless of the type of new ocean use that might be coming, and better understanding what exists now. And I think the fear is that this great information that we've compiled, that things are going to change over time. And so how do we continually update that data and maintain that data over time so that it's fresh and it's available, and that it's accurate, and especially in light of changing ocean conditions, that's going to influence how patterns of uses are changing over time. And so I really feel like, while I think it might be helpful for the federal partners to think about what specific issues you have that this can help advance, to a certain extent for us, it's been really helpful to not have a specific thing, although then that opens it up in a planning process to then it's about everything and what are you doing and why. So it is helpful to have some examples, I think, to help hone in on the kinds of information that might be helpful to include. But I will say, back to since this is an evaluation as well, that I would say that on the data side, I want to put a shout out to the data portal folks, because I think that they've continually tried to help improve that tool over the last year with the limited funding we've had. And I know we haven't been as engaged given the status of our state process, but I'm really looking forward to continuing to hone and develop that tool so that it's a helpful place for people to access the information that we have on the West Coast. So I would say that we've done a really good job, I think, on that part. So I think I'll stop there and see if other people have things to say. So.
And just Chad, this is Becky Smythe for the audio streaming, NOAA. I appreciate that input, and actually I was thinking some of the issues might be informative about the scale rather than necessarily being just the drivers, but some really good points on how to approach planning, not around the issues, but around sort of the outcome of what are we trying to do, better decision-making, better data coordination so that decision-making is enabled. But how do we figure out what scale we address some of these things at, given what could be very small scale or very large scale, thinking through some of those conversations and where the subregions might make sense or not. I think that's part of our challenge of like, how do we address Canada to Mexico? So I really appreciate that thought. And yes, the data portal is key, and they've done a great job with 2 cents rubbed together. So looking forward to your proposal later today.
The light might not work, so just...
Is it on now? Yes. Okay. This is Commander Amy Wirtz with the U.S. Coast Guard. So I just kind of wanted to comment on sort of that whole thread of the conversation, that I think for the Coast Guard, there's great value in this regional planning body organization, and value similarly in not having a specific driver, because although a lot of our authorities and actions on projects that would happen require a driver in order for us to assess something, we don't really have sort of a planning mandate for setting up the framework for how to create areas for different development and respond to projects. But having this forum creates the broader context so that as those projects either come to be assessed or are in that initial planning stage, we have the broader context that we've gained from the states and the other federal agencies and the tribes to be able to approach things in a different way, rather than each of us. I often think that if I were on the other side of the coin and trying to gain a permit to do something in the ocean or trying to develop a project, that it'd be very difficult to navigate and understand the various permits and agencies that I have to deal with. And even being where we are as regulators, it can be the same way, right? Is that we need to understand where we all fall in line with each other's jurisdictions and with each other's authorities, and having the planning body come together so that we can all understand where those lines are drawn and where we overlap is a very useful thing. And that moving forward, I think we as an organization in the Coast Guard, we like discrete projects because then we understand what we're responding to. But that this body allows us to kind of pull up and take that higher level view over the whole impact once we are responding to one.
Thank you. One question that did come up on this November call, and I think we've been kind of scratching at it a little bit. It kind of is the first two bullets here, but I'm curious for feedback on the group, from the group on this, is around a planning product for the region. We have subregions that, again, we'll hear about this afternoon, that are looking at different approaches and different processes of how subregions may proceed. And we have obviously a lot of work already underway at smaller scales for the West Coast. But a question that has been brought up a few times is there something that we're going to produce for the full West Coast that maybe is not a sub-regional plan per se, but something else that would be for the full West Coast, whether that's issue specific. Obviously, data is a huge piece, so maybe it's related there. We have a regional ocean assessment that, again, we'll talk about this afternoon, that has more of the science aspect. But I'm curious from the group's perspective if there is something there that is region-wide, if there's an issue that we're all dealing with throughout the whole West Coast. And again, I think it's really interesting and helpful to hear that, you know, there doesn't necessarily need to be an issue driver for everybody, and maybe it's helpful not to start in that context. But I know I've had that question come up, and others in our group have brought it up of, you know, is there some thread that maybe we should be looking at that's going to be helpful to tackle from the whole West Coast? I'll stop there, but yeah, please feel free to chime in on that.
Ed Bowles, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is just preemptive for Jen, who was going to steal the mic again for a while. So we may be on the same theme, but yeah, John, I still sound a little Eeyore-ish, but to me, our positioning here on the West Coast, as well as both ecologically, but also our position on the West Coast, in my mind, is kind of being the voice crying in the wilderness relative to what's facing us all now and into the future, are this resilience issues relative to climate change and adaptation, and a changing ocean chemistry and the factors surrounding that. And so when I first got involved with the National Ocean Policy, excited about marine spatial planning and the regional planning body, was kind of in the context of all the more governance challenges that we've got with not yet an over-allocated resource, but close to it, and everything coming in, and how are we going to fit everything in there, and the obvious need to better communicate and coordinate on those challenges kind of coming at us. But it was almost an extracurricular view of all the things going on and just how do we put the pieces of the puzzle together. And since then, I really think that it's a bit fortuitous that we've been pulled together, state, federal, tribal stakeholders. But I think we really need to shift this from how to plan about conflicting resources to how do we shape a future that's resilient at the community level, at the ecosystem level, at the economic level, to what we're seeing happen right as we speak, much faster than any of us thought. And it's having real-time effects within Oregon. I mean, it's shutting down shellfish fisheries through harmful algal blooms. It's eroding our coastline and threatening communities. It's, you know, just you name it, it's here. We're in the place of moving beyond denial to actually good data systems, good coordination systems, good governance systems, I think, in order to be leaders nationally in how we're going to address this. National Ocean Policy, I think, has been in a kind of defensive tread water mode. I think the West Coast is really in a position to really accentuate that leadership. One of the examples what just took place at the COP in Bonn relative to the Ocean Acidification Alliance. Remarkable things going on internationally. And so I just challenge us to kind of rethink what we're doing in that broader context and really lean into it, not as extracurricular, but as basic to what we do. No.
Thanks, Ed. So this is Jennifer Maddox against State Lands Commission, and I swear we didn't practice this ahead of time. But I truly believe that we do overarching, not just for California, but for the West Coast region. I do think there is a clear regional issue driver, and that is the climate change, changing ocean chemistry, and coastal climate effects on everything from waves, upwellings, sedimentation changes, coastal erosion. That's I think our clearest single issue driver. And so I agree 100% that they're one of the things that as a body we could maybe grapple with is how to evolve the foundation that the East Coast efforts have given us and evolve that into something that really does leverage our understanding of and our pressing, I think, collective desire for dealing with those coastal and ocean climate effects in a positive way. And that, again, speaks to really not reluctantly, but enthusiastically letting go of the status quo of most of our agencies' reactive personalities. A lot of us operate in a way that you are a decision-making body and you need to have something to decide on. So the way that usually works is somebody comes to you with a proposal, and those somebodies are usually somebody who wants to do something development-wise. It's not the kelp or the fish or the whales that are coming in and saying, hey, we'd like to have this little corridor for our migration. So it's up to us to flip that thinking, to think about the future, when you're dealing with an application, something that you need to make for us a lease on, we're only just beginning to look at that in the sense of, is this maladaptive? Is this resilient? What does this mean for the future? What might the future needs be when the coast changes? And so the benefit of forward-thinking planning is to look at that stuff. And so one of the things that we brought that may seem weird back there on that table, but our staff, including our California Sea Grant Fellows, put together a little leave behind about the public trust and sea level rise and the changing coastline. And so I put a bunch of copies of that back there, and maybe that's something that can kind of be sort of a background mindset as we move forward with planning. But in terms of tangible planning products, I think there's huge opportunity. We do all have different needs, different pressures. In certain areas, it's more aquaculture. In certain areas, it's more fishing. In certain, there's lots of different things in different subregions, and we're a very, very diverse coastline. But I really do think with your help, John, and with all of the smart people here, we could really have a product that talks about, I do think there's opportunity for a shared vision that then we can all refer to, know that we're all working toward the same goal, outlining some high level goals, that the representatives maybe can all agree to, even if we may meet those goals in different ways or have different pressures that would keep us from, or try to keep us from meeting those goals. And then maybe a set of guiding principles based on sort of future resilience, ecosystem protection, and balanced use of the ocean. And I really try to always stay away from the word development of the ocean. But just to I do think that we could have one or more products that really speak to the transparency, accountability, information sharing, and various guiding principles that as we move forward with our sure to be completely different plans, sub-regional plans or sub-regional plans or pilots, that those principles are always sitting there in the background and those are consistent across the board. And so that was just a suggestion on a potential high-level sort of background document or product that could be used for the region-wide.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I could not agree more strongly with both Ed and Jennifer. I think those were really powerful comments. And yes, I think that we need to be looking at climate change as the primary lens through which we view everything ocean related. And I love Jennifer's suggestion of having guiding principles for the group. I also think a tangible product really could be the data portal that's being developed that will serve as the basis for any work that we all can do on a regional basis and internally, and we can contribute data from all of our various sources. So I think that would be a really useful product that we could all use as a unifying force. So that's all.
Great.
Delahan, Brandon Fraley, Talawadaini Nation. I just wanted to emphasize what the Tribal Caucus report out was speaking to, and this is the prime opportunity under the agenda item for tangible planning products in relation to what is the trust responsibility between the federal agencies in the room and tribes within this process, having the jurisdictional clarification identified. I hear all the great things about relationship building and understanding perspectives from state and tribes in regards to decision making at your agency level, but really defining for ocean managers in that decision making capacity, that relationship would be a tangible outcome that tribes would like to see in this process. We're very good at defining and understanding our relationships with national parks, U.S. Forest Service. It's easy, it's on the ground, water moves, and so it's a little bit murky. So that is one of the outcomes that, from the Talawadaini Nation, we'd like to, understand and demonstrate a tangible outcome is understanding cross-jurisdiction, the responsibility of mutually coming to terms with a decision and engaging in that decision-making process. So those are the key things that we'll be discussing and prioritizing throughout this planning process as something that it needs to be solidified. It's much different than the East Coast with a handful of tribes. If you're dealing with 140 tribes, it's can be a monumental task to understand how you get sign off on all those tribes if it's going to be a major undertaking within the ocean waters. So the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has gone through that process of trying to understand how do they engage all the federally recognized tribes in California on proposed actions. So this is the opportunity that we have before us to better understand and clearly define our expectations in our relationship that we have together for this process for decision making or these management plans.
Great. Thanks, Bree, and thanks everybody for the perspectives too on the regional stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
One I was just going to add to Bree's comments, because I think the benefit of all of those goals that were mentioned in the Tribal Caucus update and what Bree just spoke to just now are that the people at the table are subject to change. As tribes know, it can be very difficult when you have a new agency representative coming in. You're starting again from square one. The benefit of doing what Bree just suggested is that it's a way to institutionalize. It also addresses, you know, Ed and Jen, what you guys were saying about looking to resilience. The way tribes think of that is usually planning for 7 generations out, the generations after you. And I think if we can find a way to institutionalize some of the relationships, you know, regardless of how funding changes, of how people change, that's a way that we can really build that resilience throughout the system, so that no matter what specific ocean planning issue we're looking at, we have that structure of resilience built in place. That's all I wanted to add.
Thanks, Megan. Anybody else that hasn't chimed in want to share anything along these lines at this point? We're going to jump to public comment next, but these are all key issues, I think, throughout what we'll be talking about today. And again, this is not enough time to really dig into this in the level of detail that we need to, but I do think this is a really helpful way to start to think about it and think about the context that we'll be discussing related to subregions this afternoon, related to the data portal, science pieces. And I think overall, the theme of what is really the regional consensus around things that we need to be paying attention to related to climate and topics like that, and how does that fit into what we're thinking about related to planning, related to subregions, and how do those integrate with one another? How do they stay separate, whatever it might be? And so that initial perspective is really helpful. And I would say from the audience as well, as we get comments, you know, please feel free to speak to the same types of issues or others that you think might fall into these same lines. So with that, I'll check just to see if anybody else wants to add anything before we go to public comment and then lunch. No, okay. Well, we had a public comment sign-up sheet out back. I have 2 folks signed up. If anybody else would like to sign up to provide comment, again, we will have 2 more this afternoon, mid-afternoon, and then also at the end of the day. So we hope folks will continue to comment as they see fit. But with that, I will bring up the 2 folks that did sign up now, and we'll say 5-minute, give or take, since we have a little bit of time here before lunch. We're pretty well on schedule, so that's a good sign, hopefully. So we'll have Jim Hausner, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Jaime Yanke give us comment here in a minute. We'll start with Jim. So Jim, if you can come up and 5 minutes and just introduce yourself and your affiliation, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, John. Yeah. I guess it's been a year since I've seen or talked to any of you. Jim Hausner, California Marine Affairs and Navigation Conference. We're an NGO here in California. There is no state port agency in California, so the port's created CMANC, as we call it, 60 years ago, to represent the collective of large and small ports. So LA Long Beach, Port San Luis, Crescent City, pretty much everybody along there. Part of this conversation with you will be some questions and then a couple of comments. We've been fortunate enough, because we're active in Washington, to be involved with the National Ocean Conference Council proposal back when Nancy Sutley and staff was putting it together. We were also very lucky and fortunate in terms of the Governance Coordinating Committee, and one of our former directors, Geraldine Natz, was on that, and somebody we worked with very closely for a decade or longer, Brian Baird, with the Resources Agency, was on that. So we've had some ability to work at the federal level during the entire process of developing this. Some questions for you, and this is somewhat out of your documents and don't need any answers. Last year, there was some discussion about refining the goals that are listed in the charter, not changing the charter, but refining those goals. And so it'd be nice to know if that has happened and where those are. There's been some discussion about the regional planning body's work plan. Be nice to see the latest version and have that available for people as we move forward, so we can help you a little bit that. John referenced earlier today the implementation handbook. I've never seen one, which I thought was interesting, because I've been active in both the Northeast and the Marco process, and wanted to move along on that one. The ocean assessment, and it was my first review of it was this morning. You had some server problems, and so it was not available to the public, I guess, until yesterday to review. 2 things that popped out that were missing. Central California has commented about this quite a few times to various folks. Socioeconomic studies. And where is that? It's totally lacking in that document, or maybe it's buried in there under human stuff and you can't figure out where it is, or perhaps it's under the fisheries piece. The other part, and I found this really interesting, especially coming from the state co-lead comment about sediment management earlier. Nothing about regional sediment management was in there. We have a active process here in California, as does some of the other states. Jennifer and I worked closely on the West Coast Governor's Ocean Portal and the Sediment Plan, which is a document that got completed by that technical advisory committee back in those days. So just want to make sure that those pieces do get in there. We've talked a little bit about sea level rise today, you have, and let's be honest about it. Sediment is going to be one of the ways that we can adapt and mitigate as we move forward and do things such as living shorelines and other things. And so it's a crucial piece as we move ahead. You talked in your, I believe it was your November meeting, about the federal and state questionnaires. Again, it'd really be nice for the local folks to be able to see what some of those things are that you're discussing so that we can anticipate and work back with you a little bit about it. So I don't have to jump up and down too many more times. I will talk a little bit at the communication and outreach program. I'm curious about what the geographic area for the Oregon, Northern California subregion is. Is it Point Arena, San Francisco Bay, Point Sur? Where is the southern boundary of that? Because that's going to impact our coastal communities. And coastal communities, rather small, don't have a lot of staff, don't have a lot of government employees necessarily to attend meetings, and that would be important to us as we move forward. Tangible planning products. I actually like the concept that the data portal will be the tangible planning product out of this, because that certainly is a good starting point. But we're really concerned, and we have been, CMAQ has been concerned about what the certified plan is going to look like. It's an uncertainty, and one of the things that happens once the plan gets certified is federal agencies are supposed to align their budget to the plan. And that is troublesome a little bit. And so the question is, exactly how is a tangible planning product, or a planning product period, going to tie back into the certified plan? Because that has some uncertainty, and one of the things that nobody likes as we move forward is uncertainty. Thank you for your time.
Hello, my name is Jaime Yanque. I work for Point Blue Conservation Science, and I'm glad to be here. First time I am at one of these meetings, and it's nice to see what you guys are trying to accomplish. I have two ideas for, I guess, tangible products or regional issues that could be addressed by the group. One of them could be a West Coast-wide exercise, and the other one could be a Central California type of exercise. For the West Coast, I think that we could try to figure out how to address shipping as a way to decrease whale mortality strikes, as a way to reduce pollution closer to the coast, and as a way to decrease ocean noise. A paper we recently published shows that we're likely killing 8 times more blue whales than it is allowed is the wrong number, that it is suggested as the annual take in the stock assessment produced by NOAA. They said that they can be about 2. We're probably killing about 18 of them. And anyway, so it could be a great West Coast-wide exercise, coming up with changes in where the traffic occurs, how far from the coast it occurs, whether you need areas to be avoided, and so on. Another exercise that would be more of on a regional scale could be dealing with entanglements and crab and other trap-type fisheries. Currently, the state of California is trying to deal with that and has a working group that has a series of NGOs that are working together with the fishermen, and they're trying to develop indicators to assess in advance whether the coming year will be a year that will lead or not into a large number of entanglements. However, no one is dealing with the special issues for the future, whether you need to have special areas that open at different times based on the presence of wildlife or not, and areas to be avoided also for fishing. Anyway, that's my contribution. I'm happy to talk more with anybody interested in this. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning. Brent Greenfield with the National Ocean Policy Coalition, and thanks, John. I hadn't signed up, but just had a couple quick comments I wanted to add. One on the discussion about tangible planning products. I would agree with the comments made by the second to last person who just spoke with regard to a focus on the data portal and steering away from a region-wide plan for many of the same reasons that were mentioned, given the impacts that these plans have once they're certified and the directive under the National Ocean Policy Executive Order, under which all the agencies at the federal level are required to implement them to the fullest extent. It introduces a lot of uncertainty and concern for our members that span the commercial and recreational sectors across the United States, including here along the West Coast. Also, just wanted to relay a request. I understand that from some of the meeting summary documents that were released from some of the recent calls that there's going to be some discussions tomorrow that are going to be in a closed setting. Would just request for future meetings that those types of meetings be made available and accessible to the public as well. And if they're not, that you all could release a summary as soon as possible from the discussion and post that on the website and make that available. Especially with obviously the discussion about funding from federal agencies is relevant because regulated industries, of course, rely on those agencies for in a time of limited resources to go through their permitting and other processes, but also to the degree that there's outside funding and concerns that we've relayed throughout the years about perceived or actual biases that could come in to play depending on the organization that's providing the funding. So that's all I have for now. Thank you all.
So I will just check to see if anybody else would like to provide comment at this point. All right. All these comments, just for the group's awareness too, are being captured, and so public comments received will definitely be included in the summary. As follow-ups warrant, some of these topics that I think or issues that were mentioned, we will be discussing further today, so we'll definitely be getting into that in more detail. But these are things that will definitely be taken into account and followed up on both in the summary and as kind of the broader context of next steps for the RPB. So thank you all for that input. We will have public comment again in mid-afternoon and also at the end of the day as well. But with that, we're ahead of schedule. It's just about noon on the dot, so we are now going to break for lunch and then return at 1 o'clock. In terms of logistics, I know there are a few spots here on the boat that you can do a sit-down lunch. There's also a cafe just down the deck here that has sandwiches and things like that. So feel free to explore if you haven't explored yet. This is quite the place, and there is definitely plenty of space to sit outside in the sun and warm up some. So we will return at 1 o'clock. Hopefully the room will be a little bit warmer by that point too. But thank you, everybody. We'll be back at 1 o'clock.